So, in the last video, we looked into some ethical issues with heaven and hell. And one of the problems that was raised is this problem by a philosopher called Bernard Williams, who said that essentially you have two choices with heaven. Either you stay who you are, but you will eventually get bored, or the only way to avoid boredom is to essentially become someone else, in which case it's not you surviving in heaven. It's somebody else, but it's not you. So that was sort of a foretaste to this issue of what would it take for me, this human creature, to survive my death. Because what we know for a fact is that our bodies die. Our bodies die and bad things happen to our bodies. So if we are, as for example Animalism says, if what I am is a human animal, then it doesn't look good for the chance of an afterlife, because we know bad things happen to this chunk of flesh. There can't really be something that exists in a heaven or hell that is me. So are there theories that allow for the possibility that I do survive? And we're going to look at some of the major theories of what is called personal identity. I've got a ton of videos about this elsewhere, but I'm going to go briefly over this, focusing on the issue of an afterlife. The view that seems to hold out the most obvious promise is a view called dualism, which in the Cartesian form, Descartes, it's called dualism because it involves a belief in two kinds of basic stuff in the universe. So there's matter, which is the stuff that physics studies, the stuff that's made of atoms or quarks or whatever. That is just one kind of stuff, and it obeys the rules of matter. It takes up space. It has a location. It has mass, all of these kind of features. But on top of that, or in parallel with that, you might say, there is also mind. Now, in Descartes' version of this, René Descartes, the inventor of Cartesian coordinates, so every time you look up something on a map, you've got him to thank. On Descartes' version of this, minds are, they have no features in common with matter. Mind has no features in common with matter. So because matter has the properties of taking up space and having a location, according to Descartes, mind doesn't. So if you ask, as the great band The Pixies asked, where is my mind? Descartes would say, there's no answer to that question. It's like asking, I don't know, what color is the flavor of vanilla? You know, flavors don't have colors. That's a category mistake, as they're called in philosophy. So minds don't have locations. But also according to Descartes, whose most famous slogan you probably heard of, I think, therefore I am, we, people, are most essentially minds. So he says in his work, The Meditations, the thing that he knows most basically that cannot be doubted is that he thinks. He is a thinking thing, he says. So therefore, I am my mind. I also have a body, but that's not what is called essential to me. That is, so that suggests my body is part of me now, but it is also entirely possible that I can exist without it. So to use terminology that another great philosopher, the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, used, you can distinguish between features of yourself that you do have, but that you could exist without, and he calls those accidental properties, and features of you that if you lose those features, you cease to exist. So features that you cannot exist without. Those are your essential properties. According to Descartes, your mind is essential to you, whereas your body is just accidental. And that doesn't mean, by accident. It just means you do have it. It is a feature of you right now, but you could exist without it. Way before Descartes was writing this in the 1500s, Plato, back in 4 centuries BCE, was arguing for something similar. And Plato was a huge influence on Christian thought. So this idea that we have a soul in Christianity, that is mainstream Christianity view, probably was influenced a great deal by Plato. And Plato argued that, Plato actually believed that our soul exists not just after we die, but also before we're born. And he had this whole theory of how the reason we know what words mean is because our soul learns what words mean by encountering something called the forms, which you may have heard of. That's a Platonic idea, before we're born. Now, you don't have to believe in all that to believe in souls, but it's an interesting theory. Okay, so Plato and Descartes are the ancient philosopher and the early modern philosopher most associated with this idea. Then we've got some contemporary philosophers, Richard Swinburne and William Hasker, who give versions of dualism. Swinburne's is more sort of traditional, although he talks about the possibility that the soul could have evolved at some, so you didn't have souls, and then at some point matter evolves to a certain kind of sophistication, and then souls evolve. So that's an interesting wrinkle. And then Hasker has this view called emergent dualism, where he says that souls are definitely different kinds of things, but they're like magnetic fields. In other words, they emerge from features of matter. It's not quite materialism, which is the idea that there is no such thing as a mind, there's only matter. He doesn't say that because he says that souls are different kinds of things, but it's not quite regular dualism, because it's clear that they can't really exist independently, or it's hard, you can't have a magnetic field existing without magnets causing the magnetic field. So those are sort of the options. Now, the problem with Descartes' version of the mind-body problem of dualism is something called the mind-body problem, which again you've probably heard of. And this is the question of how do they interact? If my mind and body are completely distinct kinds of things, how does one affect the other? And it's clear that they do, right? It's clear that it works in both directions. If I drop something on my foot, that's a material event happening to a material object, my foot, but it causes pain in my mind, and pain is a mental event. So how is it that this physical change causes a mental change? And of course it works the other way around. If I make a mental decision to raise my arm, I can raise my arm. So clearly, what we call our minds can affect our bodies, and our bodies can affect our minds. How does this work on Descartes' view, given that minds don't even have locations? How is it that my mind is associated with this particular body so that I can't move anybody else's body, and if things happen to other people's body, they don't cause pain in my mind? So there's clearly a close association between one mind and this body. How would that work if minds don't even have locations? How are they paired up? And nobody ever solved this problem, essentially. There's no solution to the mind-body problem if you have a view like Descartes'. There's also the problem of evidence. What's the evidence for the existence of minds? There there really isn't evidence of existence of minds existing separate from bodies. There's also the problem that Bertha Mannanen goes into in detail in the piece that I had you read. It just seems obvious that our minds are incredibly closely associated with our brains. If mind and body were totally different kinds of things, then damage to my brain wouldn't affect features of my mind. But we know that not only does damage to my brain cause my memory to change, it can cause fundamental features of me to change. The famous example of Phineas Gage, this guy who was building a railroad and tamping down explosives into a rock to explode the rock because the railway had to come through, and he caused a spark on the side of the hole that ignited the gunpowder, and it fired the metal rod that he was tamping the explosives down with. It fired it through his skull and, off into the distance. So this giant metal rod entered through this eye, pierced his brain, and went, hundreds of yards further on. I think that's the story, but you can look him up. He's a famous case. You'd think, well, he's dead. But no, he survived. But what was interesting, of course, was that his personality changed completely. He was a nice, easygoing guy who would never swear. He became somebody who swore all the time, got into fights. What we discovered then is that your personality is a feature of your brain. And of course, we see this with people who get Alzheimer's, all these kind of things that you think are essential features of your mind, because of changes to your brain, change. So personality, memory, sexuality. Alzheimer's can cause somebody who's been a lifelong heterosexual to become gay or vice versa. This is reported in Alzheimer's care quite often. People who are, very demure and shy can become sex addicts just because of changes to their brains. This is the things that you don't want to know about grandma in Alzheimer's care. So it seems pretty clear that your brain and your mind are very closely associated. And that seems to imply that animalism is the correct view. One more case that I haven't talked about. Perhaps the most widely discussed theory of personal identity was put forward by this guy, John Locke, who lived after Descartes in the 1600s, who argues for the psychological theory of personal identity. And we'll get to that in a second. But part of his argument for the psychological theory involves debunking the alternatives. So he has an argument against both animalism and the idea that we are a soul. And the example that he gives to suggest that even if we have a soul, he doesn't dispute that we have a soul. He says he doesn't argue either way. He says maybe we have a soul, maybe we don't. But he says even if we do have a soul, and the soul continues to exist after my body decays, do I continue to exist? And he suggests no. Because as he points out, look, the matter that I'm made of, first of all, it changes all the time. Like famously, the stuff that you're made of changes every 7 or 8 years. So you are made of completely different atoms than you were from the ones you were made of 7 or 8 years ago. And what happened to the atoms? Well, they've gone on. Maybe somebody else has the atoms that were part of you. Okay, so something that was you is now somebody else. Now, given that your atoms continue to exist after you die, does that mean that you survive? Obviously not. So the continued existence of the stuff that you're made of doesn't mean that you continue to exist. You are a special arrangement of the stuff that you're made of that cannot survive. Just like, if my kid builds a tower out of blocks and I knock them down, even though the blocks survive, the tower is gone. And the same with the atoms I'm made of. And Locke says, well, that's true of atoms, but it could also be true of a soul. Suppose I'm composed of both atoms and a soul. Well, just as the survival of the atoms after my death doesn't mean that I continue to exist, so the continued existence of the soul after I exist doesn't mean that that's me. And he gives the example of, he met a guy, a Christian Platonist, somebody who believed in Plato's theory of the soul, who said that he had the soul of Socrates. Socrates was Plato's teacher. Yeah, they had the big three philosophers of ancient Greece. Socrates taught Plato, who taught Aristotle. It's like the best 1, 2, 3 punch ever. So this guy claimed to have the soul of Socrates. And Locke says, Locke is clearly skeptical, but he says, suppose he's right. Suppose he really does have the soul of Socrates. Does that mean that he is Socrates, which is what would be true if you are your soul? Because if Socrates was his soul, and this guy is his soul, and it's the same soul, then this guy is Socrates. But the guy couldn't remember anything that happened to Socrates. He had no memories before he was born. He just said, no, I've got his soul, I'm not him. So what that appears to show is that the survival of the soul doesn't mean the survival of you, even if they exist. So imagine if you were offered this deal. Your soul will continue to exist and it'll be in heaven, but it'll be wiped clean of all your memories. Do you exist? And I think a lot of people would say, well, no, I don't exist. So what Locke takes that to illustrate is that actually you're not the stuff you're made of, mental or physical. You're the contents of your mind. You're the memory and personality. And if that goes, then it doesn't matter that the mental or physical stuff that you are made of continues to exist, because that's not you. It's like, if you drew a beautiful chalk picture on a slate and then wiped it clean, the picture's gone. It doesn't matter that the slate continues to exist. The picture is gone. And it's like we're the picture. And the picture is painted on a soul, but the soul is not the picture. And the continued existence of the soul is not the continued existence of you. All right. There are other issues with dualism, and in general, it's not a hugely popular view in philosophy. Obviously, Swinburne and Haskell are exceptions, but they're certainly in the minority. Hylomorphism. I'm not going to say much about this. She saves the discussion of this towards the end of the chapter. It's kind of a complicated view associated with Aristotle, and Aristotle was a huge influence on the greatest of all Christian philosophers, St. Thomas Aquinas. So Aquinas basically takes most of Aristotle's theories wholesale and just sort of kind of adds God. Aristotle's theory is that we are both matter and form. Any object is both a matter and form. So the matter is the stuff that Aristotle, by the way, did not believe in immaterial stuff. He disagreed with Plato on this, as on many things. He famously said, I love Plato because Plato was his teacher, but I love the truth more, which is why he disagreed with Plato, because the truth led him away from Plato's view. Aristotle said that we are matter and form. So like a statue. A famous example is a statue is a lump of clay, let's say. But so you could say that the clay is the same stuff as the statue, but the statue is more than the clay because the statue has a form. And this allows him to explain what change is. Change is when either the same matter the matter stays the same and the form is different. So you get a lump of clay, and then you mold that into a statue, and then you smush it. Only in the middle phase do you have a statue. So that's how you change from no statue, statue, no statue. Even though you got the same clay, change is explained because there's a different form to the clay in the middle part. This is all very brief and sketchy, and Aristotle is a notoriously sophisticated philosopher, and I'm not doing him justice, but this is just a sketch. Anyway, so what is the form? It's in some sense like the shape of something, but it's more like the organization of the matter. So we can talk about forms separate from the matter of which they are, but can the forms exist without the matter? This is where Aristotle disagreed with Plato. Plato talked about forms too, and for Plato, forms were these perfect versions of things whose reality was greater than anything. Plato said that the world we live in is a lower level of reality than the world of the forms. Aristotle disagreed. He said this is reality. It doesn't get any more real than this. Forms and forms don't exist separately. They are part of our reality. And furthermore, in some sense, they're even derivative from our reality, because forms cannot exist without the stuff of which they're made. So if what I am in particular is a particular form applied to this chunk of matter and changing chunks of matter, you get the same, with me, you get the same form applied to perpetually changing matter. As somebody said, human beings are slow motion fountains because we're always taking in materials when we eat and getting rid of dead cells by shedding them or shitting them out. We get rid of, we're perpetually changing our material stuff that makes us up, but it's still us. And Aristotle's explanation for that is because the form doesn't change. Now, if you associate the soul with the form, then this is an argument that says we have a soul. But the trouble is, it's not the kind of soul that allows us, obviously, to exist after our physical death. Because souls, on Aristotle's view, can't really survive. Now, again, some people say there's a possibility that Aristotle allows that souls can exist without the body. But now Aquinas suggested that the soul could exist, but the soul is not us. This is the important thing. What I am is the combination. So I am a combination of matter and form or soul. And once the soul separates from the matter, you don't have the combination anymore. You just have the soul. And that's not me, because, you know, in some sense, it can't even really exist. However, Aquinas' suggestion is actually in keeping with the traditional Christian idea that when you die, you cease to exist, and then everybody has to wait until the day of judgment, and on the day of judgment, there is bodily resurrection for all the people who have died in the past. But in the meantime, between your death and the resurrection, there's this gap when you cease to exist. That's when your soul, kind of like a blueprint maybe, is existing in storage. You're not existing because you have to be a combination of that and matter, but sort of something that will enable you to be resurrected. The sort of plans for you are being stored, and then bodily resurrection will happen. That's the kind of possibility for immortality. What that means, of course, is if Grandpa's just died, Grandpa is not in heaven or in hell looking down or looking up. Grandpa doesn't exist until the day of judgment. So it's not consistent with that view that, you know, the people who've died are in a currently existing afterlife. Okay, animalism. This is a view that went out of popularity for a while, mainly because of Locke's criticism of a view like that. But it has been revived by a few thinkers. One of them is Peter van Inwagen, who is a Christian, and another one is someone influenced by van Inwagen, who's probably done most to popularize it, was this guy Erik Olson, who is not a Christian. Now, animalism says, it means what it says. It says it's a materialist view. It says there is no such thing as an immaterial soul. We are just human animals, and that's what we are. So that means when we die, we cease to exist. So on Olson's view, there are disputes amongst the animalists. So for example, when do we cease to exist? Technically, if you're a real animalist, anima is the root means alive. That means you are essentially alive, so that if you die, you cease to exist. Something dead cannot be you because, remember, essential properties. Being alive is an essential property. Whereas some other people say, no, I'm a physical object, and as long as the physical object continues to exist, then I exist even if I'm dead. So, for example, a guy called Fred Feldman says that we talk about burying Aunt Ethel. Aunt Ethel dies, and we talk about burying Aunt Ethel. Is it Aunt Ethel? Strictly speaking, Olson would say, no, it's not Aunt Ethel, because Aunt Ethel ceases to exist when she stopped living. It's Aunt Ethel's remains, whereas Fred Feldman says, no, I believe that it really is Aunt Ethel. You continue to exist as a corpse after your death. And then there's a question of, well, when do you stop existing? Presumably when you become liquid enough to disperse. Then you stop existing. But anyway, you get the basic idea. It's a simple idea. It's the sort of intuitive idea that we are this. Now, does that allow any possibility of an afterlife? It doesn't look like it, because we know bad stuff happens to this. Certainly if you believe we are essentially alive, doesn't look like it. Now, as I said, Van Inwagen is a Christian philosopher, and he suggests, now I'm not sure how serious he is about this, but he says, well, it's not impossible that we could continue to exist, and he suggests the simulacrum view. Now, simulacrum means something that looks just like a thing, but isn't it? So like a clone or a copy. And the simulacrum view says, when you die, at the moment of death, actually you don't die. God whisks you away to an afterlife. And the thing that we know rots and decays in the ground is actually not us. It's this simulacrum that God swapped at the moment of our death. So if God can do that, then Van Inwagen, who is a materialist, he's not a dualist, he believes that we are physical objects, then us as physical objects could exist in an afterlife, and the thing that we see decays is not really us. Critics of this view call it the body snatcher view, and it doesn't paint, it seems to make God kind of a deceiver. Why is he doing this? Why is he making us think that all our relatives are rotting in the ground when in fact he saved them at the last minute? Why? That just seems insane. So another Christian philosopher who I don't think shares Van Inwagen's materialism, but wants to suggest there's an alternative view, is this guy called Dean Zimmerman. And he has this view where it's not really body snatching, but we sort of divide like amoeba. So the thing that remains is us. It's just we have divided like an amoeba. So the thing that is buried really is stuff that was making us. It's just that there's this outgrowth of us that pops off, that gets transported to another dimension or something like that. I don't know that that's much of an improvement, but at least it says that the thing that is buried really was us. But there's still this thing that, why is God messing with us in this respect? Now, the problem for a view that suggests that heaven and hell are really physical locations where our physical bodies go, is first of all, how do we get there? Now, presumably God could do, they could be in a parallel dimension maybe, and God can sort of zip us instantaneously into a parallel dimension. So I guess if God can do anything, God could do that. But then the question is, okay, what are we like when we get there? Are we the same as when we die? Well, in that case, doesn't it make a lot more sense to die young and beautiful, And what about someone like, someone like James Dean, who dies decapitated? You know how she mentions Harry Potter in the article that you read, and of course, if you've read Harry Potter, one of the ghosts is nearly headless Nick, whose head is attached by just like a flap of skin here. Is that what, does James Dean get to carry his head around in the afterlife, or is it reattached? All these kind of questions. But again, wouldn't it make more sense, particularly if you've got Alzheimer's? That's because of physical changes to your brain. Presumably, if you are the same in heaven, then you've got Alzheimer's because your brain is the same. Now, if you don't like that idea, does God fix us? Does God sort of, go to work on our physical bodies? Do we get to choose? No, make me a bit younger. Maybe I always wanted to be taller, that kind of thing. These kind of questions are left unanswered. All right. A criticism, there's a couple of criticisms for animalism as a view of personal identity, quite apart from what it says about possibility of an afterlife. Now, the reason why animalism was not a popular view for the longest time is because, as I said, the next theory that we're going to talk about, Locke's theory, was dominant, at least in philosophy, probably not, in popular thought, but certainly in philosophy. Locke's view has been very influential. And Locke gives this little thought experiment that's basically it's Freaky Friday, okay? So if you're familiar with Freaky Friday, in Freaky Friday, the mother and the daughter swap, well, what? Do they swap bodies? It depends on how you describe it, what you believe. If you say they swap bodies, then it seems like you're suggesting that they are their souls or something like that. But certainly, we think of it as the one in the mother's body is actually the daughter, and the one in the daughter's body is actually the mother. So in describing the case like that, we are revealing that we are not animalists. Why? Because we don't, an animalist would describe it in these terms. The mother is still the mother, but now she thinks she's the daughter. She's mistaken because she hasn't stopped being the mother. She's just confused and thinks she's the daughter now. Because, of course, if you're the animalist, you say the one in the mother's body, that's the mother, because the mother is the human animal, and that hasn't changed. It's just in Locke's example, it's a prince and a cobbler that swap consciousnesses. Now, you might be a little bit confused. You might say, well, this appears to support the soul theory, and I thought you said that Locke doesn't believe in the soul theory. Well, no, what Locke believes is in the consciousness theory. He does actually, in the chapter in his essay, describe it as swapping a soul, but it's not the soul that's important. It's the memories and personality and consciousness. And actually, you can describe the case without even involving a swap of souls. You can just say it's just a swap of consciousnesses, of memories, personality, all of the contents of your mind. It's not the stuff that your mind is made of that is important. It's the contents, the mental contents, the beliefs, desires, personality, memories. Those are what's important. Whenever you describe in Freaky Friday and you say, okay, this swap has happened. Now, which one is the daughter? And everybody agrees that the daughter is the one in the mother's body, which is not what animalism would say. So it seems intuitively we are not animalists. We believe if something like Freaky Friday happened, then the daughter has a new body. So what that shows is that she is not essentially her body, because she can change her entire body and still be her, whereas animalism says that's impossible. A more modern criticism given by Jeff McMahon, among others, he just gave a kind of extended version of it. I've got a video on that if you want to check it out, is that animalism says there's one person per physical creature. We are essentially like, if you're counting the number of individuals, you count the number of organisms. So if there are 3 organisms, there are 3 individuals. Whereas in the case of conjoined twins, what you have, in conjoined twins, you have, like they were going to be identical twins because the blastocyst that they started out as was going to divide. And if it had entirely separated, they would be regular identical twins. But what happens is it didn't entirely separate, and you get various degrees of conjoined, or what used to be called Siamese, because of a famous pair of conjoined twins from what was then Siam. So conjoined twins, and there are plenty of examples. McMahon talks about a specific pair of girls, where they share basically one pair of legs and a trunk, and then it divides after that. So they've got 2 heads, 2 brains, and they have 2 names. And they regard themselves as 2 entirely different people. They can argue, they can agree. What they can't do, of course, is separate, because they share most of their body. And what McMahon says is, here's an obvious counterexample. You say to count the number of individuals, you count the number of organisms. This is one organism. They share heart and lungs. The heart that pumps blood round one person's body pumps it round the other person's body. So there's one organism, but there's clearly 2 people. So we, given that they're 2 different people, but they share an organism, then they cannot essentially be their organism, because then they would be one person. But given that there's 2 of them and one organism, must be, we are not essentially the organisms of which we are made. So that's a criticism of animalism. And they've got various responses, and you can check them out. Okay, Locke's theory, psychological theory. This suggests that, crude version of this is, you are what you remember being. So, what makes me the same person now as the person that started recording this video is I remember being that person. What makes me the same person now as that kid in my kindergarten school picture, I vaguely remember that event. Now, so there you go. The criterion of personal identity across time is a later organism is the same person as an earlier organism, so long as there is a mental connection. What this means, of course, is that if I got total amnesia, wiped clean, now not just memory's gone, but personality changed and everything, then I would not be the same individual. That would be a new person. That wouldn't be me. So in other words, if there's a person that shares my body in the future, it's not me if it doesn't remember being me, or if it doesn't have a substantial enough psychological link with me. So for example, the case that Bertha Mannanen talks about of a student she has who had this event where, an accident where she doesn't remember anything before she was 16. This seems to imply that she was never born, or she came into existence aged 16 in a 16-year-old body. Now, who was that person who lived 16 years up to that accident? Don't know, but it wasn't her, it's somebody else. So Locke's view opens up all kinds of interesting possibilities. For example, if you believe in multiple personality disorder, there are many persons existing in a single organism. Locke does in fact make a distinction between what he calls man, which we can think of as human animal, and person. And he describes an animalist theory and says that's what it is to be the same man, is to be the same organism, but it's not what to be the same person. So Locke argues that you can have two persons existing in a single human. If you have not seen this show, go out and subscribe to Apple TV or get the free sample and watch this show, because this is the best show of the past decade, in my opinion. In my humble opinion, it's called Severance. It's on Apple TV, and this has a great illustration of Locke's. Locke describes this possibility, but this is a good illustration of it, of two persons existing in one human. And in this show, people have a chip planted in their brain, and it has this effect. When they go to work, it severs the consciousness of outside of the building that they go to work in, so that once they're in work, they have memories only of being in work, and when they're outside work, they have memories only of being outside, and there's no connection. So outside work has no knowledge of what's going on inside, and vice versa. So the people in working in this office don't even know if they have families, don't even know if they're married, don't even know their sexuality, don't know their personality, anything like that. Complete severance. And in fact, one character comes to hate her outside, but I gave it away. It's a female character. Her outside person, and threatens the outside person by threatening to commit suicide, because she can kill the outside person by killing herself. But she doesn't regard that as her, even though it's got her body. It's a different person. So person is consciousness. And if you have two consciousnesses that are unconnected, innies and outies in the case of severance, then they're different people. And Locke even suggests various interesting examples. What if one of them commits a crime? Should you punish the other one? No, says Locke. So Locke says, what if you commit a crime and then you don't remember it? Obviously, human law is going to want to punish you. You know, suppose you murder someone and you leave your prints at the scene and some of your blood and stuff, and then you wake up and you're being arrested and you have no memory of it. Are you guilty of it? Locke says no, because it's not you. It's a different person, because to be the same person, you would have to remember it. Now, you're going to get punished by the law, because the law goes by animalism. But he says God will know better, and God will not punish you, will not punish the person who doesn't remember the crime in the afterlife. They won't go to hell for it. So the interesting suggestion is, if there are two consciousnesses stuck in one body, if the body dies, two people arrive in heaven. One body dies, two people arrive. Maybe one goes to heaven, one goes to hell. Interesting suggestion. So now this sounds like the soul theory, but as he says, soul is a substance. It's a stuff. And he's just talking about the consciousness. So if you think of, like if you write a paper, you can save it on a thumb drive. People still use thumb drives, right? Or you can upload it to the cloud. It's the same paper, but you can put it in different places. Now, you can think of the thumb drive as like a soul. And you can save a paper on a thumb drive, and that's like memories in the soul. But then you can wipe the thumb drive clean. The paper is gone, but you've still got the thumb drive. Locke is saying you're like the paper, you're not like the thumb drive. The soul theory says you're like the thumb drive. You're like the thing that contains the memories. Locke says, no, you're like the memories, the information. Now, the information by itself is a bit like Aristotle's soul, in that you can't have the information really existing disembodied. The information has to be in something. Now, maybe it can be in a different kind of thing in heaven. Maybe we could take the information that's in the brain of a living person And that information at death could go and be put into a new person, a new body, or a new soul. That would seem to open the door for an afterlife. But there are problems with that. First problem, though, is Locke's theory suggests that I was never a fetus. Why was I never a fetus? Because fetuses don't have consciousness, or at least an early fetus. So they weren't making memories, so I wasn't that. Or even, worse, Locke's theory seems to suggest that I didn't exist before about the age of 3 or 4, because I don't have memories before that time. My earliest memories are probably about the age of 4. Before that time, it wasn't me, according to Locke's theory, because I have no connection with it. Now, a guy called Derek Parfit tinkers a bit with Locke's theory and makes suggestions. So, for example, Parfit suggests it can be you even if you don't have direct memories. So I remember being 5, the 5-year-old remembers being 4, the 4-year-old remembers being 3. So even though I don't have direct memories of being 3, I am that 3-year-old because there's a chain of memories that can connect me now to that baby. So, but even Parfit wouldn't allow me to be a fetus, because fetuses act their consciousness. Like, we become aware sometime in the 3rd trimester, probably. But it's very dim awareness, and it's not really connected to later. We don't form memories. We have consciousness before we can form memories, people think. We're not entirely sure. So, for example, fetuses can respond to stimulus. That suggests that maybe they're conscious. And the brain, so long as the brain has formed enough. But they don't remember that later because they haven't yet made memories. So there is a conscious fetus, but it's not me, even on Parfit's view. And also people in persistent vegetative states are alive. So animalism would say, Terry Schiavo, this famous case in Florida, a couple of decades ago now, Terry Schiavo still existed while she was being kept alive in a persistent vegetative state. Whereas a psychological theory says, no, Terry Schiavo was already gone because the part of her brain where consciousness happened, the cerebrum, was already irretrievably damaged. She was no longer capable of consciousness, but she was alive. So your question is Terry Schiavo still there? Animalism says yes. This theory says no. And actually, I think a lot of people kind of side with the psychological theory. And as Bertha Mannanen points out, there are 2 death dates on Terry Schiavo's grave, which suggests to me that the husband, if you look into the Terry Schiavo case or you remember it, there was a battle between the husband and the parents. And the parents wanted to keep her alive indefinitely, and the husband said no, she wanted to be unplugged. So I assume the husband won out and got the death dates. Basically, he said she stopped existing when she had this aneurysm or whatever it was that cut off oxygen to her brain, that meant that she had to go into hospital and be kept alive on a respirator. So he basically said she stopped existing when the brain got damaged. Now, so some people see that as a problem for the theory. Other people say, no, it's just an implication of the theory and I'm okay with it. A more serious problem for the theory, it doesn't sound like it's more seriously because it sounds science fiction-y. But imagine if you could duplicate the consciousness. Suppose there's another TV show that I also recommend. It's not as good as Severance, but it's pretty good. It's called Upload. And it's on Prime Video. So if you have an Amazon account, you've already got access to it. If you haven't seen it, check it out. And the basic idea there is that they've invented these computer afterlives, where if at the point of death, your consciousness gets uploaded into a virtual environment. So if you're rich, you afford a really nice afterlife with plenty of memory, and then at some point in the show you see the poor people who have practically no computer memory allotment, so they have a very bare bones existence in the afterlife. But they continue to exist. In what sense? Well, all of the information that was in their brains is captured in this brain scan and encoded into computer memory. Would that be them continuing to exist? If that was possible, then what would also be possible would be duplication. Once you've got the information, like with a paper, you know, you can upload your paper to one, you can put your paper on one thumb drive, you can put it on another thumb drive, you can upload it to the cloud, it can be copied. There could be millions of copies of one paper. There could be millions of copies of all of the information in your brain. Which one is you? Well, they can't all be you, because they would go on to have different existence. So given that they're not the same, suppose we have two versions of you. Call them, well, let's call you A, and then you die, and we upload two versions of you, B and C. Now, what we know for a fact is that B does not equal C. They are not the same, because let's say they interact, they talk to each other. So they can't both be you. They're two different individuals. Well, then do we say that A is B and C is and A is C? Well, originally we would have said that because they're both copies of you. And if there was only one of them, then we would say that one is you. But given that there's two, we can't say that either of them are, because if A equals B and A equals C, then by the rules of identity, that means that B equals C. But we've already said B does not equal C, so therefore these things can't be true. And if you are duplicated, it suggests that duplication is death. If there's more than one copy of you, then neither one of them gets to be you, and you cease to exist when you die. So what are these copies? They're just things that think they're you. They're future clones. It's as if, you know, after you die, somebody makes a copy of you that walks and talks and genuinely believes, you know, it's got implanted memories that thinks it's you. That's not you. It's just somebody that thinks they're you. So you have ceased to exist. And so this suggests maybe that's what's happening in upload. Actually, everybody has died, and we just have tragic clone versions of them that think they're them. That's not really the afterlife that we want. We don't want someone up in heaven who thinks it's me, but isn't actually me. I want to be the one that makes it to heaven. And this problem suggests that merely having your consciousness survive is not good enough. Problems like that led to McMahon's theory. McMahon was a student of Parfit, greatly respects Derek Parfit, regards him as a genius, but thinks that problems like this mean that you can't go for a full psychological account. So he says, basically, he agrees with most of the things that Parfit says about psychology being very important, which is Locke's central point. Locke's central point is, what do we care about in identity? It's not the stuff we're made of, it's our memories and our personality. That's what we want to continue to exist. And so McMahon agrees with that. But he says, because of problems like this, you don't survive unless not only do memories continue to exist, but also the brain that holds the memories. So when he says embodied mind, it's basically a brain theory. And not even the whole of the brain, because he said the brain stem isn't responsible for consciousness. If you could replace the brain stem, it would still be you. But it's the brain, part of your brain that stores your personality and memories, basically the rest of the brain. That's what's you, and as long as that continues to exist, then you continue to exist. And also, he has something to say on the fetus theory. So he says, in one respect, his view is more strict than Parfit's. He says, in the case of upload, that's not you in the computer, even though, you know, maybe in one sense your consciousness continues to exist and that thing has memories of being you. it's not you because it's not existing in your brain. But in another sense, his view is more generous, because he says, Parfit says the fetus isn't you because you've got no memories going all the way back to the fetus. Whereas McMahon says if there's minimal consciousness, even if memories are not being formed, then that can be you. So it goes, McMahon's theory of the embodied mind, you go back further. You were a fetus. And even if you have fairly severe Alzheimer's, that can still be you. Whereas Locke and Parfit would say no, if you can't remember, they require more of a psychological connection than McMahon does. Now, again, what would you say about McMahon's? Well, first of all, you would say you would have to have a Van Inwagen or Zimmerman theory of body swapping for that to allow survival after death. Because if you are your brain, well, we're pretty sure the brain, something bad happens to the brain. And then, Alzheimer's, if somebody dies of Alzheimer's, then they're pretty much gone because the brain has decayed. Are we committed to the idea that we're our brain? Well, what if we take our brains and we replace them cell by cell with, artificial neurons? What if they develop artificial neurons that don't degrade in the way that actual neurons do, and they replace our brain neuron by neuron with these artificial ones? Does it remain us when all of them have finally been replaced and it's not a human brain, but there's been no break in consciousness? Would that still be us? And if that's possible, well then why can't we just take the consciousness and put it in something else? Why are we so committed to the stuff that it's made of? So Locke would have a problem with this because, again, it seems to be saying the stuff that I'm made of is important, whereas Locke and Parfit say, no, it's not the stuff you're made of, it's the consciousness itself. Okay, tie this back to heaven and hell. It looks like the most promising theories are the least likely theories. That is, dualism. I mean, one of the things about dualism, if dualism was true, then things that happen to your brain wouldn't affect your consciousness. Your consciousness isn't in your brain, it's in this separately existing mind. So damage to your brain, it would be, damage to your brain would at worst damage the connection between your mind and your brain. So it'd be like your mind would continue to be sharp, but you wouldn't be able to convey information. That's not what's happening with Alzheimer's. Their minds are going. Their personalities can change. Their sexualities can change. So that just doesn't seem true. And anyway, can we really imagine existing entirely disembodied when our senses are bodily things? It would be like sensory deprivation tank. How would that be? We can't even imagine what it would be like. Hylomorphism, maybe that allows bodily resurrection, but then there's a question of, if what we are is tied to the stuff that we're made of, maybe if the stuff that we're made of changes cell by cell, we can continue to exist. So for example, if I have a tower and I knock out a brick and then I replace a brick, because enough of the tower is still there, we would say it's still the same tower. But if you knock the entire tower down and build it out of new bricks, it's not the same tower. Isn't that what will happen in resurrection? It's a new me. It's a new version that thinks it's me, but it's not really me. That's the problem. It's a fascinating area of philosophy, and I recommend it. But we gave you a quick overview, and there you go.